The resolution was inevitable, really. Their academic construct was a beautiful, logically consistent house of cards waiting for the first breath of reality to blow it down. They'd built an entire theoretical framework around humanity's fear, without considering humanity's courage, without accounting for curiosity, without understanding that sometimes what looks like caution is actually calculation. Their understanding was about to meet its first actual human, and theories have a funny way of collapsing when they encounter facts. But reality doesn't read textbooks, and it certainly doesn't care about academic certainty. You know that moment when expectations shatter? Not gradually, but all at once, like glass hitting concrete from a great height. The class gathered in the observation gallery overlooking the shuttle bay, their various sensory organs focused on the airlock doors. They'd positioned themselves behind reinforced transparency alloy, some students actually leaning back slightly as if expecting an explosion. Professor Clicks floated at the front, data slate ready, tentacles poised to record first impressions. The atmosphere handlers had already lowered the lighting to what their research indicated was a comforting dimness for humans. Sound dampeners hummed softly throughout the bay, creating the acoustic equivalent of a padded room. They'd prepared for someone who needed psychological kid gloves. The airlock cycled with a series of mechanical sighs and hydraulic hisses. The massive doors slid apart with the smooth precision of alien engineering. Steam or condensation or whatever passed for it in their atmospheric mix, billowed out in a gentle cloud. Every student leaned forward slightly, expecting to see a hunched figure, someone moving cautiously, perhaps with defensive posture. They'd studied human body language extensively from intercepted media. They knew to look for crossed arms, lowered gaze, the subtle signs of a species that lived in perpetual caution. Instead, Jake Morrison stepped out like he was entering his own living room. He stood straight without being rigid, his shoulders relaxed, his hands loose at his sides. He wore standard civilian exploration gear, durable fabric and neutral colors, functional without being tactical. His eyes scanned the bay with open curiosity, taking in the architecture, the technology, the assembled aliens behind the observation window. He didn't look afraid of his own shadow. He looked genuinely interested in theirs. A slight smile touched his lips, the kind that says, "Well, this is fascinating," rather than "please don't eat me." The aliens exchanged glances that needed no translation. Bort's crystalline fingers stopped tapping his data slate. Zara's bioluminescent patterns shifted from academic recording to confused flickering. One of the methane breathers made a soft bubbling sound of disbelief. This human didn't match any of their psychological profiles. He moved with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own skin, completely present in the moment. He glanced at the observation window and gave a small, casual wave that was neither frantic nor fearful, just acknowledgement. Professor Clicks's tentacles twitched, then began rapidly adjusting his notes. He muttered to himself in his native tongue, the translation matrix picking up phrases like atypical specimen and deviant from baseline. He tried to fit this calm, curious human into his fear-based framework, suggesting perhaps this was an elaborate coping mechanism or pathological denial. His tentacles moved faster, adding annotations to his files, trying to make the reality conform to the theory rather than the other way around. The first crack had appeared in their academic certainty. It wasn't a dramatic fissure, just a small hairline fracture in their understanding. They'd been so sure they knew what humans were, traumatized, cautious, fragile. This human was none of those things. He looked like someone who belonged wherever he happened to be, someone who met strange new situations with interest rather than anxiety. The carefully constructed narrative of humanity as perpetual victims was already starting to fray at the edges. Then they saw what was standing beside him. It had been partially hidden by the residual mist from the airlock, standing so still they hadn't registered it as a separate entity. But as the vapor cleared, there it was. A four-legged creature with alert posture watching them with calm assessment. It wasn't leashed or restrained, just standing naturally at the human side. And in that moment, every assumption they'd made about humanity faced its second, even more dramatic challenge. How do you classify something that breaks all your classifications? The aliens were about to find out. Jake gestured to the creature beside him with a casual hand motion that seemed completely at odds with what they were seeing. He introduced him as Max, adding that he was from Earth but not human. The simplicity of the statement contrasted sharply with the complexity of what it implied. They had studied Earth's fauna extensively. They knew about predator hierarchies, food chains, the delicate balance of ecosystems. None of their research had prepared them for this particular arrangement. The alien students immediately began categorizing, their various sensory and analytical systems working overtime. Bort the Garak accessed his species' extensive xenobiology database and identified the creature as Canis lupus, a wolf. His crystalline fingers trembled slightly as he confirmed the classification. This was no harmless companion animal. This was an apex predator, a species known for pack hunting, incredible endurance, and lethal efficiency. The database contained footage of these animals bringing down prey much larger than themselves, working together with chilling coordination. Zara's crystalline form flickered through several panic colors before settling on a worried amber pulse. She had studied Earth's predator-prey relationships extensively, and everything about this situation violated the natural order as she understood it. They saw the muscular build, the alert posture, the intelligent eyes that missed nothing. They noted the teeth, not just the visible ones, but the potential behind them. This was a creature built for biting, for holding, for tearing. Its evolutionary heritage screamed predator in every line of its body. The German shepherd stood calmly, his ears slightly forward, his tail at rest, but to alien eyes trained to see danger everywhere, he might as well have been growling. Their fear-based taxonomy had categories for pets, for livestock, for wild animals, for threats. It had no classification for an apex predator standing calmly beside a sentient being, without restraints. Professor Klix tried to maintain academic control of the situation. His tentacles formed the shapes for domesticated and non-threatening. He explained that humans kept various species for companionship or utility, that this was likely a case of selective breeding reducing natural instincts. But his own tentacles betrayed his uncertainty. They twitched and quivered in patterns that his students recognized as cognitive dissonance. He was trying to force this reality into his existing framework, but the pieces didn't fit. Domestication, in their experience, meant creatures like the fuzzy, six-legged grazers on Alpha Centauri IV, animals that had evolved to be completely dependent on their keepers. This creature looked anything but dependent. It looked like it could handle itself just fine in any environment. Their entire fear-based understanding of Earth's ecosystem was collapsing in real time. They'd believed humans lived in constant anxiety about predators, that their civilization was organized around avoiding becoming prey. Yet here was a human standing casually beside what their own databases identified as a highly effective predator. The cognitive dissonance was almost physical in the room. The students' various recording devices slowed or stopped as they tried to process this contradiction to everything they'd been taught. Their neat categories of dangerous and safe, predator and prey, these were completely inadequate for whatever this relationship represented. The resolution was both simple and devastating to their academic framework. Their fear-based taxonomy simply had no category for this. There was no box to check for apex predator that appears to be working with rather than against the sentient species. Their entire understanding of Earth's ecological dynamics would need to be rewritten from the ground up. They stood there, various species from various worlds, all united in complete confusion about what they were witnessing. Then Max made his presence known in the way dogs have done for thousands of years. Sometimes sound is all the evidence you need. Max chose that moment to announce himself with a single sharp bark that cut through the shuttle bay's artificial quiet. It wasn't just the volume, though that was impressive enough in the enclosed space. It was the quality of the sound, a sudden authoritative burst that echoed off metal walls and made the very air vibrate. To alien ears trained on different acoustic patterns, it registered as something between structural failure and weapon discharge. Several students physically recoiled, their various forms jerking back from the observation window. Bort's crystalline fingers actually reached for a sidearm he wasn't carrying. Zara's bioluminescence flashed bright red, the universal coloration for danger among her species. One of the methane breathers emitted a high-pitched whistle of alarm. Professor Klix experienced the sound as a physical blow to his academic certainty. His tentacles, which had been poised in a teaching posture, went completely limp. All his theories about controlled human environments, about gentle first contact protocols, about treating humans as fragile beings, they evaporated in that single explosive moment. Here was direct sensory proof that their entire approach was wrong. The sound wasn't just loud noise. It carried primal authority. the kind of sound that commands attention across species lines. It was the acoustic equivalent of a warning label that read, "Handle with respect." You know how sometimes reality doesn't just contradict your expectations, it laughs at them. That bark was reality having a good chuckle at Professor Clix's expense. His carefully constructed narrative of humans as timid survivors couldn't survive this auditory evidence. The creature they'd categorized as domesticated had just demonstrated that domestication didn't mean what they thought it meant. This was no subdued, broken animal. This was a being with presence, with voice, with the capacity to make itself heard and felt in no uncertain terms. The professor's tentacles, which had been his primary means of expression and communication, now hung limp and useless. His body seemed to deflate as the cognitive dissonance became too much to process. The gap between his academic theories and the visceral reality in front of him was simply too wide to bridge. His systems, overwhelmed by the contradiction, opted for the simplest solution available. Professor Clix folded neatly at his middle joint and collapsed to the deck in a dead faint, his data slate clattering beside him. The classroom's safest assumption, that they understood humanity and its relationship with its world, just hit the floor along with their professor. The students stared between their unconscious teacher and the scene below, their various recording devices forgotten. They'd come to observe a species defined by fear, and instead found themselves facing evidence of control, companionship, and now, this dramatic demonstration of presence. Their entire framework for understanding humanity needed immediate and drastic revision. But Jake was already moving to reassure them, his hand going to Max's shoulder in a calming gesture, even as he glanced up at the observation window with an expression that seemed to say, "Don't worry, this is normal." The human's response to the dramatic bark was so casual, so matter-of-fact, that it only deepened the aliens' confusion. They were witnessing something their textbooks had never prepared them for, a relationship between species that defied all their categories and expectations. The bark had been the exclamation point on a sentence they were still struggling to read. You know how some phrases change everything? Jake looked up at the observation window where the aliens were still processing the bark and their professor's sudden departure from consciousness. He gave them a reassuring smile that seemed utterly inappropriate given the circumstances. "He's a good boy, Max," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the bay's audio pickups. The words landed with the subtle impact of a hammer on glass. The tension in the observation gallery became almost physical. The phrase "good boy" didn't match the creature they were seeing. Their databases contained extensive information about Canis lupus, hunting behaviors, pack structures, predatory efficiency. Nowhere in that data was there any category for good. Their definition of that word involved compliance, harmlessness, perhaps even weakness. This creature represented the exact opposite of everything they understood as good. It was powerful, alert, potentially dangerous, and had just demonstrated its capacity for startling vocal projection. Then Jake made a slight hand signal, just a subtle motion that wouldn't even register as communication to most species. Max immediately sat, his posture perfect, his attention focused entirely on Jake. The transition from potential threat to perfect obedience happened in less than a second. There was no struggle, no hesitation, no visible conflict. One moment the creature was standing alert. The next it was seated calmly, waiting for further instructions. The change was so instantaneous it seemed almost magical. The aliens struggled with the cognitive dissonance. Their various sensory and analytical systems tried to reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew to be true. Bort's crystalline fingers hovered over his data slate, unsure what to record. Zara's bioluminescence flickered through confused patterns that didn't correspond to any known emotional state. They were witnessing something their science said shouldn't be possible, an apex predator responding to subtle commands with immediate compliance. Their understanding of predator psychology had no framework for this level of control. Their definition of good simply didn't include apex predators. In their experience, dangerous species were managed through barriers, through technology, through avoidance. They had protocols for dealing with wildlife, regulations for transporting hazardous biological materials, entire departments dedicated to interspecies safety. The concept of calling a creature with that much physical capability good was like calling a plasma torch friendly. The words didn't belong together in any sensible universe. The resolution was both simple and revolutionary. They weren't witnessing avoidance or suppression. They were seeing partnership. The control wasn't about domination, but about communication. The obedience wasn't forced, but offered. This was something entirely different from anything in their experience with other species. Their fear-based framework, which had seemed so comprehensive just minutes before, now appeared primitive and incomplete. They were looking at a relationship model that their science had never contemplated. This wasn't humans living in fear of predators. This was humans working with them. The implications began to dawn on the more perceptive students. If humans could establish this kind of relationship with Earth's predators, what did that say about human capabilities? What did it suggest about their understanding of other species? Their entire death world theory was unraveling faster than anyone could have predicted. Then Jake asked if they'd like to see more, his tone suggesting he had plenty to show them. The question hung in the air, simple and devastating to their previous certainties. They'd come to observe a species they thought defined by fear, and instead were being offered a demonstration of something much more interesting, a species that had learned how to turn potential threats into partners. What does disciplined cooperation look like? When it walks on four legs and follows verbal cues? Jake began a demonstration that would answer that question with unsettling clarity. He started with simple commands first. Sit, stay, down. Each delivered in a calm, level tone that carried through the shuttle bay. The aliens watched, expecting the kind of simple pet tricks they'd seen in intercepted human media. They anticipated clumsy obedience, half-hearted responses, the kind of behavior that suggested the creature was humoring its keeper rather than truly cooperating. They got something entirely different. Max executed each command with precision that would make a military drill team take notes. When Jake said sit, the dog's hindquarters hit the deck plates with perfect form, spine straight, attention focused. The stay command produced absolute stillness. No fidgeting, no breaking position, just patient waiting despite the strange environment filled with unfamiliar smells and alien observers. The down command brought immediate compliance, the transition smooth and controlled. Each movement was crisp, each response immediate, each execution perfect. You know how some demonstrations strip away assumptions layer by layer? This was one of those. Max maintained laser focus on Jake despite the utterly alien surroundings. The strange lighting, the unfamiliar atmospheric mix, the bizarre creatures watching from the observation gallery, none of it distracted him from his handler's commands. His ears stayed forward, his eyes locked on Jake, his whole body poised and ready for the next instruction. This wasn't an animal vaguely following cues for treats. This was a working partner operating at professional standards. Then came the play dead command. Jake gave a simple hand signal and verbal cue, and Max dropped to his side as if struck by an invisible force. He went completely limp, eyes closed, breathing shallow, the perfect simulation of death. Captain Vex, who had remained silent through the entire demonstration, actually took a step forward. Her insectoid eyes focused intently, her mandibles parting slightly in what her species did instead of gasping. She'd seen tactical simulations, combat drills, strategic exercises across multiple species. None of them had prepared her for witnessing this level of controlled response in a biological entity. This wasn't entertainment. This wasn't a simple pet trick. This was controlled power on display, the channeling of natural instincts into precise, reliable responses. The aliens were seeing predation harnessed for service. They witnessed how natural alertness became focused attention, how physical capability became precise execution, how predatory heritage became disciplined cooperation. Their understanding of what constituted trained behavior was undergoing radical revision in real time. The resolution settled over the observation gallery like physical weight. They weren't watching a human controlling an animal. They were witnessing a partnership where both parties understood their roles completely. The control wasn't about suppression, it was about direction. The power wasn't diminished, it was focused. They were seeing something their science had never documented, predation channeled into service rather than eliminated or avoided. But this was just the basic package, the fundamental obedience training that millions of human dogs received. Jake had mentioned there were specialized versions, advanced training protocols, specific applications that took this foundation and built upon it. The aliens were only seeing the entry-level demonstration, the common, everyday version of this relationship. The realization dawned slowly. If this was standard, what did advanced look like? When does training become symbiosis? The answer wasn't in any of their textbooks. Jake began explaining the human-dog relationship in terms that made the aliens' various cognitive processes stutter. They'd been watching what they thought was a master-servant dynamic, a simple case of one species dominating another. Their frame of reference included agricultural animals, exhibition creatures in zoos, and at best, companion species that provided simple emotional support. What Jake described was something entirely different, a partnership that had been millennia in the making. He talked about coevolution spanning thousands of years, a gradual process where both species changed to accommodate each other. Dogs weren't captured and broken to human will. They chose this relationship. Early wolf populations began lingering around human camps, finding advantage in the scraps and protection human groups offered. Humans gained early warning systems, hunting assistance, and warmth during cold nights. It was a mutual arrangement that benefited both sides from the very beginning. The aliens listened, their various recording devices momentarily forgotten, as they tried to process this radical reinterpretation of interspecies relations. You know how some truths rearrange everything you thought you knew? This was one of those moments. The relationship wasn't about domination but cooperation. Both species gained tangible benefits: protection from threats, companionship that reduced stress, improved survival rates for both groups. Humans didn't just take from dogs, they gave back food, shelter, medical care, social integration. Dogs became part of human families, human work, human emotional lives. The exchange was so balanced, so mutually advantageous that calling it domestication seemed completely inadequate. Their predator-prey framework failed completely under the weight of this new information. This wasn't humans living in fear of predators. This was humans forming alliances with them. Their entire academic construct, built on the assumption that Earth was a death world where species existed in constant conflict, needed fundamental revision. They were witnessing not avoidance but integration, not fear but partnership. The implications extended far beyond human-canine relationships. They suggested a completely different model for how species might interact. What made this realization particularly jarring was the scale of cooperation they were witnessing. This wasn't some small-scale experiment or unusual case study. Jake described how dogs had integrated into virtually every aspect of human civilization across the entire planet. They worked alongside humans in countless capacities, shared their homes, participated in their social structures. The partnership wasn't exceptional. It was foundational to human society as they knew it. Their death world theory, which had seemed so comprehensive just hours before, now appeared hopelessly simplistic. They were seeing interspecies society in actual operation, not as theory, not as laboratory experiment, but as lived reality spanning thousands of years and billions of individuals. The control they'd witnessed wasn't about suppressing natural instincts but about directing them toward mutual benefit. The obedience wasn't about submission, but about coordinated action. Every assumption they'd made about human psychology, about Earth's ecology, about the very nature of predation needed to be reconsidered from the ground up. Then Jake mentioned the scale. He didn't present it as anything remarkable, just a matter-of-fact statement about how common this partnership was. The numbers he cited weren't exceptional cases or statistical outliers. They represented standard human experience across their entire civilization. The aliens realized with growing astonishment that what they were witnessing wasn't some unusual human behavior. This was normal. This was every day. This was how humans actually lived with the species they'd categorized as deadly predators. Their academic certainty was being systematically dismantled by simple, demonstrable reality. How do you process planetary-scale partnership? Jake delivered the numbers with the casualness of someone stating the obvious. The aliens had assumed Max was an exception, some rare human eccentricity, perhaps a single individual who'd managed an unusual bond with a dangerous animal. Their frame of reference included zoo specimens, laboratory animals, maybe the occasional exotic pet kept by wealthy collectors. What Jake described was something else entirely. He mentioned figures that made their various cognitive processors stall. Not hundreds, not thousands, but hundreds of millions of dogs living with humans across their planet. The scale was incomprehensible to beings who thought in terms of controlled environments and limited interactions. They'd imagined perhaps a small percentage of humans kept such companions, maybe as novelties or status symbols. The reality was that canine presence was woven into the fabric of human civilization itself. You know when a statistic stops being a number and starts being a reality? This was that moment. Dogs weren't just living with humans. They were integrated into every aspect of human society. They worked on farms, assisted in hunting, provided security, guided the blind, detected substances, comforted the distressed, and simply shared living spaces as family members. This wasn't a hobby or a curiosity. It was a global system of interspecies cooperation, operating at a scale the galaxy had never witnessed. The resolution settled over the observation gallery like a physical weight. This wasn't some isolated phenomenon they were witnessing with Max. They were seeing a tiny glimpse of a planetary-scale reality. Their death world theory, which had seemed so logically consistent just hours before, had just acquired millions of living counterexamples. If humans were truly traumatized survivors living in constant fear of predators, this level of intimate cohabitation would be impossible. The evidence wasn't in their databases or their theories. It was standing right in front of them, thumping its tail against the deck plates. Their academic framework wasn't just incomplete, it was fundamentally wrong in its basic assumptions. Humans hadn't just survived their dangerous world. They'd formed working partnerships with elements of that danger. They hadn't merely avoided predators, they'd integrated them into their social and functional structures. The scale of this cooperation suggested it wasn't accidental but intentional, not exceptional but normal. The aliens were forced to confront the reality that their entire understanding of human psychology and civilization needed complete revision. Then came the really impressive examples. Jake mentioned that what they'd seen so far was just basic companionship, the everyday version of human-canine relationships. He started describing specialized roles, advanced training, specific applications that took this foundation and built upon it. The aliens realized with growing astonishment that they'd only witnessed the entry-level version of this partnership. The basic obedience and cooperation they'd marveled at was actually the common, widespread foundation upon which much more sophisticated collaborations were built. What happens when predation becomes profession? Jake began describing protection dogs, and the aliens immediately imagined violent attack animals. Their minds filled with images of unleashed aggression, mindless violence, creatures trained to maim and kill on command. They anticipated hearing about dangerous weapons barely under control. Animals kept on tight leashes, both literal and metaphorical. Their frame of reference included guard beasts from various worlds, creatures typically kept isolated behind barriers, handled with extreme caution, used only when overwhelming force was necessary. They learned something entirely different. Jake explained threat assessment and controlled response. These dogs weren't trained to attack. They were trained to evaluate. They could distinguish between normal behavior and actual threat, between unfamiliar situations and genuine danger. Their training focused on reading body language, interpreting intentions, making split-second decisions about when intervention was necessary. The aliens listened, their various sensory organs focusing intently as they tried to process this radical concept. These dogs evaluated situations independently. They weren't simple automatons following attack commands. They assessed strangers, monitored environments, made judgment calls about potential risks. A protection dog might determine that a loud, enthusiastic person posed no threat, while recognizing the subtle cues of someone with malicious intent. This wasn't mindless aggression. This was intelligent threat analysis performed by a biological system they'd previously categorized as simply dangerous. They protected without unnecessary violence. The training emphasized de-escalation, intimidation displays that prevented conflict rather than causing it. A properly trained protection dog would use its presence, its bark, its body language to deter threats before they materialized. Physical intervention was always the last resort, and even then the response was measured. Enough force to neutralize the threat, not to cause excessive harm. The aliens found themselves reassessing their entire understanding of what constituted defensive capability. The resolution dawned slowly but completely. The aliens realized this was ethical weaponization. They were seeing predatory instincts harnessed for social good. The natural abilities that made canines effective hunters, their intelligence, their physical capabilities, their protective instincts, were being channeled into community protection. This wasn't about creating violence, it was about preventing it. The concept was so elegant it made their previous assumptions seem crude by comparison. Their fear-based perspective seemed primitive now. They'd been viewing predators as problems to be avoided or eliminated. Humans had viewed them as potential partners to be understood and directed. Where the aliens saw only danger, humans had seen possibility. The difference in approach was staggering in its implications. It suggested a completely different way of interacting with the natural world, one based on understanding rather than fear, on cooperation rather than avoidance. The protection dogs represented the highest refinement of this philosophy, taking what nature provided and refining it through training and partnership to serve social needs. They weren't weapons in the conventional sense. They were intelligent ethical systems for maintaining safety. Their value wasn't just in their physical capabilities, but in their judgment, their discretion, their ability to operate within human social contexts without causing unnecessary alarm or harm. Then they asked about the training methods. The question came almost simultaneously from several students, their various communication methods overlaying in a chorus of curiosity. They wanted to understand how humans achieved this remarkable transformation, how they turned natural predators into ethical protectors. The answer, when it came, would further challenge their understanding of human capabilities and methods. How do you turn instinct into instruction? The aliens leaned forward as Jake explained the training process, expecting to hear about coercion devices or genetic modification. Their experience with dangerous species involved containment fields, behavioral inhibitors, and sometimes chemical pacification. They assumed humans must use similar methods, perhaps more primitive versions of the same technologies. The idea that you could train a predator without force seemed counterintuitive to beings whose entire approach to danger involved either elimination or strict control. They learned about positive reinforcement and trust building. Jake described a process based on reward systems, clear communication, and mutual respect. Training wasn't about punishing unwanted behaviors, but about rewarding desired ones. The relationship grew from consistent interaction, from understanding the dog's natural instincts and working with them rather than against them. The aliens listened as Jake explained clicker training, treat rewards, and the gradual building of complex behaviors through small, incremental steps. Their various sensory organs registered confusion. This approach contradicted everything they knew about handling dangerous animals. Selective breeding enhanced desired traits, not create slaves. Jake clarified that humans hadn't engineered some new subspecies. They'd simply emphasized natural tendencies that already existed. Herding instincts, protective behaviors, intelligence, and willingness to cooperate were all present in the original wolf ancestors. Human breeding programs just made these traits more consistent and reliable. The dogs retained their essential nature. They were still predators, still intelligent, still capable. The process simply made them better partners for specific human needs. The aliens struggled to process this information. Their scientific literature contained extensive studies on behavioral modification through negative reinforcement, chemical control, and genetic alteration. The concept of achieving such precise results through positive methods seemed almost mystical. They'd assumed the obedience they witnessed must result from some form of suppression or breaking of spirit. Instead, they were learning about cultivation and enhancement of natural abilities. You know when a simple explanation unravels complex assumptions? This was that moment. The process respected the dog's nature while directing it. The training didn't eliminate predatory instincts, it channeled them. It didn't suppress intelligence, it engaged it. The dogs remained fully themselves, just with their abilities focused toward specific tasks. The relationship wasn't master and servant, but partners with complementary skills. The resolution was both elegant and devastating to their academic framework. This wasn't suppression, it was cultivation. They were seeing evolutionary partnership accelerated through intelligent intervention. Where their species might see a dangerous predator to be controlled or avoided, humans saw potential to be developed. The difference in perspective was fundamental and profound. Their academic framework was crumbling completely. Every assumption about human methods, about interspecies relationships, about the very nature of training and control, needed revision. They'd come expecting to find evidence of primitive coercion techniques. Instead, they discovered sophisticated behavioral science based on mutual benefit and respect. The implications extended far beyond human-canine relationships. They suggested a completely different approach to dealing with other species, including potentially themselves. Then Captain Vex asked the operational question that had been forming in her mind throughout the explanation. Her insectoid eyes focused on Jake, her mandibles clicking softly as she formulated the inquiry that would take them from theory to practical application. What happens when partnership saves lives? Jake moved from theoretical discussion to practical applications, and the aliens discovered their understanding of canine roles was about to expand dramatically. They'd categorized dogs as companions, seeing them through the limited lens of emotional support or simple utility. Their frame of reference included species kept for amusement or minor assistance, nothing that would fundamentally alter their view of human capabilities or the predator-prey dynamic they thought they understood. He described search and rescue operations, painting pictures of disaster scenarios where human technology failed, but canine abilities succeeded. Dogs finding survivors buried under meters of rubble, locating people in vast wilderness areas, detecting life where sensors showed only destruction. The aliens listened as Jake explained scent discrimination, how dogs could identify specific human scent among thousands of others, track it across difficult terrain, and alert rescuers to exact locations. Their various sensory organs focused intently, trying to comprehend this biological capability that outperformed their advanced technology in certain scenarios. Police work came next. Dogs detecting drugs, explosives, missing persons. Jake explained odor recognition thresholds that made mechanical sensors seem crude by comparison. A dog could detect substances in quantities so small they were practically theoretical, distinguish between similar chemical compounds, and do it all in real time without laboratory equipment. The aliens had assumed human law enforcement relied solely on technology. They were learning about biological systems integrated directly into their security protocols, living detectors that worked alongside officers as partners. Then therapy dogs, and perhaps the most challenging concept for the aliens to process. Creatures they'd categorized as predators providing psychological healing. Jake described dogs working in hospitals, schools, disaster areas, bringing comfort to traumatized humans. The same animals that could detect threats could also detect emotional distress, responding with precisely the right kind of contact to reduce anxiety and promote recovery. The cognitive dissonance was almost physical. How could something with predatory heritage provide such gentle support? Every assumption about pet evaporated in that moment. The word itself seemed inadequate, reductionist, almost insulting given what they were learning. These weren't pets in the sense the aliens understood, animals kept for amusement or companionship. These were working partners, specialized assistants, integrated components of human society performing functions no technology could fully replicate. This was biological technology they'd never imagined. Not genetic engineering or cybernetic enhancement, but natural abilities honed through training and partnership. They were seeing evolution harnessed through cooperation, instincts directed toward social good, predation transformed into protection and healing. Their entire framework for understanding biological systems needed complete revision. Their death world theory reversed completely in that moment. Humans weren't surviving despite their dangerous world. They were leveraging it. They hadn't conquered nature through technology alone. They'd formed partnerships with it. The predators weren't threats to be avoided. They were resources to be understood and collaborated with. The entire premise of their first contact protocol, based on treating humans as fragile trauma survivors, was fundamentally wrong. Then Professor Clix regained consciousness. His tentacles twitched as his systems rebooted, his academic certainty slowly returning along with his awareness. He expected to see chaos, danger, the confirmation of all his worst predictions about human instability. Instead, he found Max sitting calmly with his tail thumping rhythmically against the deck, Jake explaining interspecies cooperation to his thoroughly captivated students. The scene was so far from what he'd expected that his cognitive processes struggled to reconcile reality with expectation. How do you rebuild a shattered paradigm? Professor Clix's tentacles twitched as consciousness returned, his academic mind automatically trying to categorize the experience. Fainting. No, temporary cognitive overload due to data contradiction. He expected to find chaos when his visual receptors reactivated, students in panic, security protocols activated, possibly even containment fields around the dangerous predator. His last memory was that terrifying sound, the bark that had short-circuited his carefully constructed theories. The deck felt cool against his underside, a sensation he noted with detached academic interest. Instead, the scene that greeted him was so peaceful it seemed surreal. Max sat exactly where he'd been, tail thumping rhythmically against the polished deck plating in a steady, calming pattern. The sound was completely different from the earlier explosive bark. This was soft, regular, almost meditative. Jake stood nearby, still explaining human-canine relationships in that calm, measured tone that carried through the bay. The students weren't cowering or panicking. They were leaning forward, their various note-taking devices active, recording everything the human said with intense focus. His students were taking entirely new notes. Not the fear-based observations he'd trained them to make. Not the careful documentation of trauma responses and defensive behaviors. They were recording information about partnership, cooperation, mutual benefit. Their body language showed curiosity rather than caution, engagement rather than anxiety. They'd completely abandoned the framework he'd spent cycles building and had adopted an entirely new perspective, based on what they were actually witnessing. You know that moment when certainty becomes humility? Professor Clix experienced it physically. His tentacles, which usually waved with academic confidence, now moved slowly, almost hesitantly. He realized they'd been reading humanity completely wrong. Not just slightly off in their assessments, not missing a few details, but fundamentally wrong in their core premise. Humans weren't defined by what they feared. They were defined by what they'd mastered. Their relationship with predators wasn't about avoidance, it was about integration. Their civilization wasn't organized around survival. It was organized around partnership. The death world theory wasn't just incomplete, it was backwards. Earth's challenges hadn't broken humanity. They'd forged them. The predators weren't sources of trauma. They were potential partners. The high gravity and toxic atmosphere weren't oppressive conditions. They were simply environmental facts that humans had adapted to and even leveraged to their advantage. Every piece of their research had been interpreted through the wrong lens, filtered through assumptions that said more about their own psychology than about humanity's. His academic certainty transformed into academic humility there on the deck plates. The professor who had spoken with such confidence about human trauma now understood how little he'd actually known. The theories that had seemed so logically consistent were actually houses of cards built on faulty premises. He pulled himself upright, his tentacles moving with uncharacteristic gentleness as he brushed himself off. The students noticed he was conscious again but didn't stop their note-taking. The human's explanation was too fascinating. Then he asked to see the class log. His voice sounded different, less certain, more curious. He wanted to review their observations to see how reality had systematically dismantled his theories. The request wasn't about reclaiming authority, but about understanding where they'd gone wrong. He floated toward the main terminal, his movements slower, more deliberate. The academic who had been so sure of his framework was now more interested in the truth than in being right. The collision between theory and reality had left him humbled but strangely energized. There was so much more to learn than he'd ever imagined. You know that moment when everything changes. Not gradually, but all at once, like a switch being flipped in your understanding of the universe. Professor Clix floated to the main terminal, his tentacles moving with uncharacteristic hesitation. The class log glowed before him, containing their original assessment of humanity. Pages of analysis about trauma responses, fear-based behaviors, and psychological damage from living on a death world. Every word now seemed not just wrong, but embarrassingly naive. He began dictating a new entry, his voice quieter than usual, more thoughtful. The old entry had described traumatized survivors, a species huddled in fear of their dangerous world. The new entry described something entirely different, an apex species that had domesticated predators. His tentacles formed the words carefully, each phrase a deliberate correction of their previous assumptions. He described humans not as victims of their environment, but as masters of it, not as creatures defined by what they feared, but by what they'd integrated into their society. Humans aren't surviving their world, they're mastering it. The professor's tentacles emphasized each word with precise movements. He described the human-canine relationship not as an exception, but as evidence of a broader pattern. Their ability to form working partnerships with dangerous species suggested capabilities they'd completely missed in their initial assessment. This wasn't about overcoming nature through technology alone. It was about understanding nature well enough to collaborate with it. This changes everything about first contact protocols. The professor's tentacles moved to the operational section of the log. All their preparations based on treating humans as fragile beings needed immediate revision. The low-light environments, the sound dampeners, the gentle approach protocols, all of it assumed humans needed protection from stress. Now they understood that humans regularly lived and worked with creatures that could kill them. Their entire approach had been backwards from the beginning. Official policy shifted in real time as the professor dictated. Security protocols were updated. Interaction guidelines were rewritten. Diplomatic approaches were completely rethought. The change wasn't just academic, it became operational immediately. Captain Vex nodded her approval, her insectoid eyes following the revisions with professional interest. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was their actual plan for dealing with humanity. Fear gives way to respect and caution. The new assessment didn't make humans seem less impressive, it made them more formidable. Their ability to turn predators into partners suggested capabilities that went far beyond what their technology showed. This wasn't about being afraid of humans. It was about respecting what they'd achieved and being appropriately cautious in their interactions. The shift in perspective was fundamental and complete. Their academic exercise becomes diplomatic reality. What had started as a classroom discussion was now shaping actual interspecies policy. The students watched, their various recording devices capturing every word of the new assessment. They were witnessing theory becoming practice, academic understanding directly influencing real-world decisions. The implications extended far beyond this single encounter. This would affect how their entire species interacted with humanity. Then they discussed the implications. The professor finished his dictation and turned to the class, his tentacles forming open shapes that invited discussion rather than declaring certainty. The students began asking questions, offering observations, suggesting further areas of study. The conversation wasn't about fear anymore. It was about understanding, about curiosity, about recognizing how much they still had to learn. The death world theory was completely abandoned, replaced by a much more interesting and complex reality. The class that had begun with absolute certainty ended with thoughtful curiosity. They'd arrived thinking they understood humanity completely. They were leaving realizing they'd only scratched the surface of what there was to understand. The shift wasn't just in their assessment of humans. It was in their assessment of themselves, of their own assumptions, of how much they still had to learn about the universe. Then they looked at Max with new understanding. The creature that had seemed so threatening initially now represented something much more interesting. Evidence of human capabilities they were only beginning to appreciate. His calm presence, his trained obedience, his partnership with Jake, all of it spoke of a relationship model they'd never encountered before. Their fear had been replaced by curiosity, their assumptions by questions, their certainty by the exciting realization that they had so much more to discover. How do you recalibrate for a species you misjudged? The class discussion turned from academic curiosity to practical policy with sobering speed. Professor Clicks floated before his students, tentacles forming the shapes of serious consideration. The course they were taking, Introduction to Xenobiology, suddenly seemed inadequate. They weren't studying simple biological curiosity anymore. They were examining a species that had fundamentally changed their understanding of interspecies relations. The professor suggested renaming it Advanced Galactic Threat Assessment, and nobody disagreed. They thought they were studying victims when they began this course. Their textbooks, their lectures, their entire framework had centered on humanity as trauma survivors. Now they understood they were examining potentially formidable allies. The shift in perspective was absolute. Where they'd seen weakness, they now saw strength. Where they'd identified damage, they now recognized adaptation. The human ability to form partnerships with predators suggested capabilities that went far beyond technological achievement. Their recommendation was unanimous and immediate. They advised military clearance for all human interactions. This wasn't about fear. It was prudent respect for capability. They weren't suggesting humans were dangerous in the conventional sense. They were acknowledging that a species that could turn apex predators into working partners operated on a level of biological understanding they hadn't previously considered possible. The recommendation went straight to Captain Vex, who approved it without hesitation. Their entire diplomatic approach transformed in that moment. The gentle, careful protocols they'd developed were scrapped. The low-light environments, the sound dampeners, the cautious speaking patterns, all of it was replaced with straightforward, respectful interaction guidelines. They realized treating humans as fragile would be not just incorrect but potentially offensive. These were beings who lived with creatures that could kill them. They didn't need coddling, they needed honest engagement. They realized humanity's predator partnership was strategic. It wasn't some curious biological footnote. It represented a fundamental approach to dealing with challenges. Humans didn't avoid danger, they integrated it. They didn't eliminate threats, they partnered with them. This suggested a strategic mindset that went far beyond their initial assessment. The implications for galactic relations were significant. Humanity might approach other species with the same pragmatic partnership mentality. The Death World label became a badge of honor rather than a warning. Earth wasn't some horrible place to survive. It was a challenging environment that had forged remarkable capabilities. High gravity became evidence of physical resilience. Toxic atmosphere demonstrated biological adaptability. Dangerous predators indicated advanced interspecies cooperation skills. Every aspect they'd previously viewed as evidence of hardship now appeared as proof of exceptional capability. Then they looked at Max with new understanding. The German shepherd sat patiently, his tail still thumping rhythmically against the deck. They no longer saw a potential threat, or even just a working animal. They saw evidence, living proof of human capabilities they were only beginning to appreciate. His calm presence, his trained obedience, his partnership with Jake, all of it spoke of a relationship model that could teach them more about humanity than any sensor reading or intercepted transmission ever could. The assessment was complete. Their understanding had shifted from fear to respect, from caution to curiosity, from seeing humans as broken survivors to recognizing them as sophisticated partners. The galaxy suddenly seemed both larger and more interesting, full of possibilities they hadn't previously imagined. Their approach to first contact would never be the same, and neither would their understanding of what partnership between species could truly mean. What represents controlled power better than this? Max's tail thumped rhythmically against the deck, a steady, percussive beat that filled the shuttle bay with its quiet insistence. The sound was utterly unlike the earlier bark that had sent their professor to the floor. This was softer, more regular, almost musical in its consistency. The aliens watched, their various sensory organs tuned to this new data point, trying to reconcile it with everything they'd learned in such a short time. They'd initially interpreted the tail movement as a threat display. Their databases contained information about animals that used similar motions to signal aggression or impending attack. They'd seen footage of Earth predators lashing tails before striking, of creatures using such movements to intimidate rivals or warn off threats. The rhythm had seemed ominous, another sign of the dangerous nature they'd been primed to expect. Their fear-based training had prepared them to see danger in every unfamiliar behavior. Now they understood it was communication and contentment. The thumping wasn't a warning. It was an expression of calm alertness. Max wasn't preparing to attack. He was simply existing comfortably in the moment, his tail keeping time with some internal rhythm of satisfaction. The same creature that could protect with formidable efficiency could also connect with simple, honest presence. This wasn't a switch being flipped between modes. Both aspects existed simultaneously in the same being. The aliens struggled with this cognitive shift. Their either-or thinking failed completely when faced with this reality. They were accustomed to categories: dangerous or safe, predator or prey, threat or ally. Max embodied all these things at once. He could be a protector, a companion, a working partner, a comfortable presence. The complexity was staggering compared to their previous simplistic classifications. They were learning that Earth's creatures, like Earth's humans, operated outside their neat taxonomic boxes. This wasn't just biology, it was relationship engineering. The partnership they witnessed wasn't some accidental byproduct of evolution. It represented thousands of years of deliberate cultivation, of understanding another species so thoroughly that you could channel its natural abilities toward mutual benefit. The tail thumping wasn't just a behavior, it was evidence of that successful engineering, a sign that the relationship was working as intended. Comfort and capability existed together in the same moment in the same creature. The resolution settled over them with quiet finality. They understood the depth of this partnership in a way no database could have taught them. Predation and affection weren't opposing forces. They were complementary aspects of the same relationship. The capacity for protection and the capacity for connection came from the same source, were directed by the same intelligence, served the same partnership. Their either-or thinking had been inadequate for understanding something this sophisticated. Then Jake prepared to leave. He gave a small signal that was barely visible to alien eyes, and Max rose smoothly to his feet. The tail stopped thumping as the dog focused on his handler, ready for whatever came next. The transition from relaxed comfort to working readiness was instantaneous and seamless. The aliens watched, their various recording devices capturing every detail, understanding that they were witnessing the end of a demonstration that had fundamentally changed their perspective. The shuttle bay seemed quieter without the rhythmic thumping that had provided such a counterpoint to their revised understanding. They realized that sound would stay with them, not as a memory of threat but as evidence of something much more interesting. They'd come expecting to study fear and found themselves learning about partnership instead. The weaponized wagging tail had been their final lesson in human capabilities. Not the destruction they feared, but the connection they'd never imagined. How do you process ordinary extraordinariness? Jake mentioned he needed to get back to Earth, adding that Max had his dinner waiting. The casualness of the statement landed with more impact than any dramatic revelation could have. The aliens had been witnessing what they thought was a unique marvel, a singular example of human capability so remarkable it deserved special study. They'd been taking notes as if documenting some rare phenomenon, some exceptional case that would become a famous example in xenobiology texts. They learned this wasn't exceptional at all. Jake explained that millions of humans had similar partnerships with canines across their planet. The number wasn't remarkable to him. It was just a fact, like stating that many humans lived in cities or used transportation. His tone suggested this was normal, everyday human experience, not something worth particular note. The aliens exchanged glances, their various sensory organs trying to process this information. What they'd found astonishing was apparently commonplace. This isn't exceptional, it's everyday human life. The realization settled over them slowly but completely. They weren't witnessing some human superpower or rare talent. They were seeing standard human existence, the kind of thing that might happen in any neighborhood on Earth. The precision obedience, the threat assessment capabilities, the search and rescue training, all of it was normal. Their scale of wonder expanded exponentially as they understood the implications. If this was ordinary, what qualified as extraordinary in human terms? Humanity's mastery of their world is commonplace. The Death World label underwent its final transformation in their understanding. Earth wasn't some horrible place where humans struggled to survive amid constant danger. It was a world where humans had integrated that danger into their daily lives, where partnership with predators was normal, where extraordinary capabilities were simply part of everyday existence. The high-gravity, toxic atmosphere, dangerous wildlife, all of it had been mastered to the point of becoming background conditions rather than dominant threats. The Death World becomes a world of daily marvels. Their perspective shifted completely. Where they'd seen reasons for fear, they now saw evidence of capability. Where they'd identified sources of trauma, they now recognized opportunities for partnership. The entire framework of their understanding inverted itself. Humans weren't surviving despite their world. They were thriving because of their world, because of how they'd learned to work with its challenges rather than simply overcome them. Then the shuttle bay doors closed behind them. The heavy metal barriers slid shut with the same smooth precision that had marked their opening. The last thing the aliens saw was Jake giving a final casual wave, Max standing calmly at his side. both of them looking completely ordinary and completely remarkable at the same time. The silence that followed was different from the nervous quiet that had preceded their arrival. This was thoughtful silence, the kind that follows learning something that changes your perspective completely. The observation gallery remained still for several moments after the doors sealed. Nobody spoke, nobody moved to leave. They were all processing what they'd witnessed, comparing it to what they'd expected, realizing how completely their understanding had been transformed. The academic certainty they'd brought into this encounter had been replaced by a more valuable commodity: genuine curiosity. They'd arrived thinking they understood humanity. They were leaving knowing they'd only begun to scratch the surface. The shuttle bay now stood empty, but the evidence of what they'd witnessed remained in their notes, in their revised protocols, in their completely changed perspective. They'd come to study a species defined by fear, and discovered a species defined by partnership. They'd expected trauma and found capability. They'd anticipated fragility and witnessed strength. The ordinary extraordinaries of human existence had rewritten their galactic understanding in a single afternoon, and they were only beginning to grasp the implications. What really defines a death world when the inhabitants don't act like they're living on one? The class gathered around their terminals, pulling up the original planetary surveys of Earth. The data hadn't changed. The numbers still showed gravity that would crush most species, atmosphere that would corrode standard alloys, radiation levels that required shielding. All the objective measurements still pointed to a hostile environment by galactic standards. The facts remained facts, but their interpretation of those facts was undergoing radical revision. High gravity and toxic atmosphere remained undeniable parameters. Their sensors hadn't malfunctioned. Their atmospheric analysis was correct. Their gravitational calculations were accurate. Earth still qualified as a death world by every objective metric their science recognized. The tension came from reconciling these hazardous conditions with the evidence they'd just witnessed. How could a species not just survive but clearly thrive in such an environment? The contradiction between the planetary data and the human reality created cognitive friction that demanded resolution. But humans don't just survive, they thrive. The evidence was standing right in front of them, or at least had been until recently. Jake's calm confidence, Max's trained competence, the casual way they both operated in an environment that should have been stressful. None of it matched the death world narrative. Humans hadn't merely adapted to their world, they'd clearly mastered it. Their civilization showed no signs of trauma-based limitation. Instead, it demonstrated remarkable flexibility and capability. They've turned predators into partners. This was the key that unlocked the paradox. Instead of living in fear of Earth's dangers, humans had integrated them. Rather than avoiding threats, they'd formed working relationships with them. The death world conditions hadn't broken humanity. They'd forged a species capable of remarkable interspecies cooperation. The high gravity meant humans developed strong physiques. The toxic atmosphere led to advanced filtration systems. The dangerous wildlife resulted in sophisticated understanding of animal behavior. The death world label needs redefinition. Professor Clix's tentacles formed the shapes of this new understanding as he spoke. It's not about danger, it's about capability. A death world isn't defined by its hazards, but by the species that masters those hazards. The label shouldn't indicate a place of suffering, but a place that produces exceptional beings. Earth's challenges hadn't created trauma. They'd created opportunity for development and innovation. Humanity's trauma response is actually mastery. What they'd interpreted as hypervigilance was actually heightened awareness. What they'd categorized as defensive behavior was actually strategic positioning. Every human characteristic they'd viewed through the lens of damage now appeared through the lens of capability. Their academic certainty became thoughtful curiosity. The professor who had spoken with such confidence now asked questions instead of providing answers. The students who had absorbed theories now sought understanding. Then they considered what else they might have wrong. If their assessment of human-predator relationships was completely off base, what other assumptions needed examination? Their understanding of human technology, social structures, psychological patterns, all of it required fresh evaluation without the filter of fear-based interpretation. The death world theory had colored everything they thought they knew about humanity, and now that theory was discarded. The classroom that had begun with absolute certainty ended with open questioning. They'd arrived thinking they understood humanity's fundamental nature. They were leaving aware of how much they still had to learn. The shift wasn't just academic. It was epistemological. They weren't just revising facts. They were changing how they approached understanding other species entirely. The Death World hadn't been what they thought, and neither had its inhabitants. Their education was just beginning. The academic endeavor left Earth's orbit carrying revised protocols and humbled scientists. Professor Clicks now teaches advanced galactic threat assessment instead of introductory xenobiology. Captain Vex submitted formal recommendations for military-level clearance regarding all human contact. Somewhere below, Jake Morrison threw a tennis ball across his backyard while Max chased after it. Just another ordinary afternoon in the company of humanity's best friend. Professor Clicks stood before his xenobiology class, tentacles waving with academic certainty. Humans are traumatized survivors of a death world, he declared, living in constant fear of Earth's apex predators. But when the shuttle bay doors hissed open, they didn't find a cowering human. They found Jake Morrison, calm and confident, with a 90-pound German shepherd named Max sitting patiently at his side. The aliens' theories were about to shatter against a reality they never imagined possible. You know how some classrooms feel like they hold all the answers? This one felt like it held all the wrong questions. Professor Clicks moved before his 23 students, each from a different species, each with their own specialized note-taking appendages. The classroom wasn't like the terrestrial rooms humans might recognize. Curved walls pulsed with gentle light, seats adjusted automatically for various body types, and the air carried the faint scent of ozone. The professor's purple tentacles punctuated each declaration about Earth, as if physically pushing his theories into their minds. He described gravity that would crush most species, an atmosphere laced with reactive elements, and ecosystems where everything seemed designed to kill everything else. His students recorded every word with solemn precision. Bort the Gorak tapped his crystalline fingers against a data slate, creating perfect transcriptions. Zara's bioluminescent skin flickered in patterns that archived the lecture in light-based memory. They were the galaxy's best and brightest, trained to analyze and categorize, and they accepted the professor's framework without question. Humans, according to Clicks, were a case study in permanent defensive posturing, a species that had evolved not to conquer their world, but to hide from it. Their entire civilization, from architecture to social structures, was interpreted as one giant trauma response. At the back of the room, Captain Vex observed quietly. Her insectoid eyes caught every detail, from the students' rapt attention to the professor's unwavering confidence. She'd read the same reports, seen the same planetary surveys, but something about this neat psychological packaging felt off. Her mandibles clicked softly in thought, a habit she suppressed when others might notice. She kept her doubts to herself, though. This was academic territory, and Professor Clicks was the expert. What made this lesson different from any other xenobiology class was its immediate practical application. This wasn't abstract theory. The first contact protocols being developed based on these findings would determine how their entire species interacted with humanity. The team was preparing to meet what they believed were fragile, fear-governed beings who needed careful handling to avoid psychological distress. Their approach manuals were being written around the assumption that humans required gentle reassurance and protected environments. The stage was perfectly set for a particular kind of meeting. They expected nervousness, hesitancy, perhaps even panic. They had calming pheromones prepared, low-light environments configured, and soft auditory dampeners standing by. Every piece of their preparation assumed humans would be exactly what their research predicted. Survivors, not masters of their dangerous world. Then the shuttle docked. The soft thrum of magnetic clamps engaging reverberated through the vessel's structure. Professor Clicks finished his lecture with a final flourish of tentacles perfectly timed. The students closed their notes with the satisfaction of those who believe they understand something completely. They gathered their things and moved toward the observation bay, ready to see living proof of everything they'd just learned. Why assume a species is defined by what it fears, rather than by what it masters? Professor Clicks was about to demonstrate exactly that academic blind spot in real time. He floated back to his main thesis, his tentacles forming precise geometric shapes to emphasize key points. The human mind, according to his research, was fundamentally shaped by predator anxiety. Every aspect of their psychology could be traced back to evolutionary pressures from creatures that wanted to eat them. He painted a vivid picture of early humans huddled in caves jumping at shadows, their entire existence governed by the need to avoid becoming someone else's dinner. You know when someone explains your own nightmare to you and gets all the details slightly wrong? That was Professor Clix describing human civilization. He cited Earth's oxygen-rich atmosphere as evidence of planetary volatility, completely missing that most species would find it perfectly breathable. The gravity well that kept humans planet-bound was interpreted as a constant physical oppression, rather than a natural condition. Even the planet's axial tilt, which creates seasons, was framed as environmental instability rather than predictable variation. His students nodded along, recording these facts as if they were absolute truths rather than interpretive leaps. They viewed humanity's survival as a statistical fluke, like winning the cosmic lottery by not being eaten. The class discussed human hypervigilance as a pathological condition, not as adaptive awareness. They interpreted human curiosity as anxiety-driven scanning for threats. Human socialization patterns were analyzed as pack defense mechanisms. Even human humor was categorized as stress-release behavior from living under constant danger. Every human trait got filtered through this fear-based framework until the species looked less like intelligent beings and more like traumatized animals reacting to stimuli. The real problem wasn't their data, it was their certainty. They'd analyzed light-year distant signals, atmospheric spectrographs, and intercepted transmissions, but they'd never actually met a human. Their confidence grew from having no contradictory evidence, like solving a puzzle with half the pieces missing and declaring the picture complete. Professor Clix displayed holograms of Earth's predators, great white sharks, grizzly bears, big cats, and each image made the students' various sensory organs flare with sympathetic alarm. They saw only teeth and claws and killing efficiency, missing entirely the ecological context or the fact that most humans never encounter these animals outside of zoos. Their entire approach to first contact was built on this foundation of presumed trauma. They planned to speak softly, avoid sudden movements, and provide reassuring environments. They designed special low-light meeting rooms and sound-dampened corridors specifically to avoid triggering human anxiety responses. The protocol manuals were filled with warnings about not startling the humans, about maintaining calm atmospheres, about treating them like fragile beings who'd survived unimaginable horrors. They were so sure they understood humanity's psychological landscape that they'd already mapped it onto official policy.